One of the biggest questions I have for you are what are Indian Gen Z like? And it feels like we focus a lot, we being the media, pieces of literature, pieces of work, focus a lot on the Western Gen Z. And not a lot is put out on Asian Gen Zs or Indian Gen Zs for that matter. So you're a Gen X, you've written a lot about Gen Z, you have a podcast called Working with Gen Z, which I highly recommend to people. What are Indian Gen Zs like as a broad question? We can dig deeper.
Sure. No, absolutely. So, Ayush, I think before we dive into kind of understanding the nuances, there are some similarities. I would say there is a common denominator among the Gen Zs in India as well. You know, the affinity towards technology, being very digital natives, all of that's there. But in the Indian context, it's a fairly complex story just because of the fact that the demographics of the country are very, very uniquely diverse and so diverse in form of social strata, the religious beliefs that you can think about, the languages, the food preferences, right? And so all of that has an impact. And very interestingly, when we talk about Gen Zs, as you rightly said, you know, a lot of what is being kind of portrayed on the media or on the popular mainstream literature, even online, is largely kind of US or North America based. And again, no harm in that. But I think to your question, you really need to spend some time to get to know, okay, what drives the Gen Z in the Indian context. So for now, let me say that I think you see very two distinct different stories. When you think about the Gen Z population on a whole, one which brings a lot more similarities to sort of the global cohort, and another one which is very unique in the Indian context, but again, which has a lot of similarities as well.
So now that we've defined kind of the theme of the podcast, I do want to indulge in some defining, if you will. So I'm a typical Canadian or American. Let's say I'm a baby boomer. I haven't thought much about Gen Z. I've thought far less about India for that matter. What are Gen Z? Who is a Gen Z? What are their defining characteristics in a couple of sentences? Then we can move on to India afterwards.
Yeah. Again, there is the formal definition of all generations by the years in which they're born, but and all the research, whether it's Pew or all the popular research bodies, right? They all caution us in the stereotypes that get attached, and it just is one of those things where you know, millennials, as we think about an example, they were the most considered the most narcissistic, and that just builds on it, and then it kind of carries around the world. Similarly, for Gen Z, there is a certain tag that's kind of associated with them, and you know, you want to use certain terminology, whether it's snowflakes or narcissistic, or the fact that, and it again, as I say, we will talk more, but. I think you want to do away with that. That's the key, and we'll get into you know if you're a manager versus even if you're a parent, right? That you just got to keep it in the back of mind. But it's a generation which has seen a lot. I mean, I see the other day my son was just saying that you know, Dad, the only thing that was left for me to see was an actual war with the neighbor. Now I'm seeing that too, and let me cross that on the list. And so he says, I've seen the climate crisis. I'm seeing the pandemic. I've seen the Me Too movement. I'm seeing all the things, the fake news that are happening. I mean, in the war itself, there was such a big thing. So their context has been, several set of cards that have been given to them. But again, I say it's a generation with lots of creativity, with lots of, I think that in my mind, with all the people that I interact with whether it's in the corporate world or even generally, it's a generation with the two or three outstanding characteristics is someone who's very vocal. They absolutely positively value transparency. And it just comes very naturally. I think they're happy to walk through a hierarchy. They're happy to question the protocol. And I think to me that is such a great thing. And so that's the positive. Obviously, on the stereotypes, you know, there could be a list, but let's not talk to that. I think I would rather focus to say that It's a generation which is extremely tech savvy, very creative, values authenticity, values transparency.
Yeah, it's fascinating what you were saying about Gen Z has experienced a lot. I'd never really, I had thought about that, but I'd never really vocalized it in that way. And now that you're saying that, they've experienced and are experiencing hyper politics, hyper information warfare, hyper cyber warfare, hyper biological warfare, hyper social warfare, hyper romantic warfare. That's a very, very, precarious and intriguing set of circumstances. How do you even begin to raise someone in that way, if I can ask a personal question?
No, you're absolutely right. It is such a challenge, Irish, because your context, and let me just give you again, while we always admire their know-how for the technology, but you look at the environment that is being shaped up. So if you think about AI, my son is applying for some schools in the US, and I think one of the things that they actually write and tell in the application is that do not use AI-based answers. We have ways to check it. So imagine that. Is a generation which likes technology, but the proficiency of the technology has reached to the stage where again they've got to be mindful of that. No other generation till their 40s or 50s had to think about is are we becoming a slave to AI, while the Gen Z is actually kind of experiencing that in their 20s, right? And the whole debate about okay, will it take away my thinking ability, or do I am I becoming is AI using me versus is it is a tool? So the point of that, you're absolutely right. And then when we hear terms like they're very fragile and this and that, to be to be fair and empathetic, I think there's just so much of, as you rightly said, hyper information overload, and hyper geopolitical turbulence that is happening, and hyper polarity in the world that is happening, right? All of that, where is the normal, right? I always say, how do you bring up someone? And so it is very extremely difficult, but what can we do as parents? What can we do as managers, right? Can we build resilience? Can we help them to kind of build a muscle of longitudinal thinking, longitudinal sort of benefit of relationships and things like that? So it isn't easy. I think there is a lot more to be done from a parental perspective to be much more conscious parenting. And I would even say that even in the corporate and the working world, the manager has to be much more involved, and not in a bad way. I think if you can do it in the right way, you can unleash so much good out of them.
Now that we've had I wouldn't say caricature, let's say a nice, bow on the framework of Gen Z, I think that's a better way to put it. How do we add the Indian context on this? So again, not to use Canadian and American again, let's say I'm a typical Londoner or Parisian, and my, experience with India is basically the last couple of weeks with, that geopolitical circumstance, which we don't have to get into right now. Um, I haven't spent much time thinking about India in any way, other than the cuisine, which is renowned in the world. So, what what are the demographics of India like? How are they different? How are they starkly different from the way other people think about it when they're on the outside looking in? One of the things we're talking about is the perception of a country from the outside looking in versus when you are internal to it and you've experienced the culture for yourself. What is the Indian culture like, the Indian demographic like? And then we can transition into Indian Gen Z, which will be the point of the
Yeah.
podcast.
Sure, no, absolutely. So, Irish, when Vodafone was coming into India, the CEO of Vodafone in UK was asked a question in a press conference that, okay, how many plans do you have in your country? And he says, we've got about 8 plans, and that's what we'll do. We'll replicate that. And, someone replied to saying that, we have 100 plans just in the city of Mumbai, just to give you the idea of the complexity of the segments that can be created, just in the sheer diversity in demographics. And Harvard has a very beautiful article in which says that you cannot have an India strategy. You need to have a state level strategy. In other words, every state in India is almost like a country in itself, right? From the languages to the government that is running it and their ideology. You've got a government which is very pro business to a small pocket which is more like a communist, which is another one. So I think that in a way, it tells you how complex the demographics is for someone who is looking from the outside in. And then for the longest time, Ayush, when I was heading a company in India, we had colleagues from UK and the US and many different parts of the world. They were just completely blown away. And the way to think, and I give you one just as an example. If you think about, we used to run a program for a client for almost more than 10, 12 years, a manufacturing company. And manufacturing companies, I think globally, and just kind of are struggling to gather good talent. And one of the things that we did was to gather about 12 people, 12 Gen Zs into a classroom to say that, okay, what is your career aspiration? And this was a deliberate focus group where about half of them were from, let's say, large towns like Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, and so on. And then the other half came from a fairly rural setup, right? What we call tier two, tier three cities. And it was amazing to see that stark difference in the attitudes and the expectations. So some of the urban guys, the kids were saying, I'm willing to join provided you're willing to tell me when can I become a vice president, what's my career path going to be like, where will I be in 10 years, as opposed to the group from the smaller towns were far more aspirational and hunger in their desire to grow, just sheerly because lesser resources, they have to fight for more things. And so there is a difference in how we look at the Gen Z population in urban versus rural. And I think the urban Gen Z, Irish, is the more affluent Gen Z or middle class Gen Z, has access to, like any other Gen Z. They can see the same sitcoms, they have access to the same products, they can buy the same things, they travel at the same locations that everybody has on a bucket list. But the rural story is different. And therefore, I think strictly from a talent perspective, if you're a company, I think people are becoming more and more deliberate about who do we get when you think about engagement and when you think about retention. So that kind of gives you an idea of how the story is shaping up.
Let's double tap on that engagement and retention. What differentiates a middle class, let's say the affluent Gen Z or the urban Gen Z, as you put it, versus the rural Gen Z? Are there, it sounds like with the way that we're setting it up, these are different species in a sense, to be a little abrasive. Do you have to think like that in terms of being a manager and marketing to these people?
Yeah, no, good point. It's almost like I was, in one of my podcast episodes, I had a colleague, my ex-colleague, who does a lot of work on first generational professionals in the US. And she's done a lot of research. And so we got it to talk saying that, okay, how do first generational professionals fare in their career over a period of time, right? So if I'm the first one to go to college, is there some data point that says that, okay, this person is likely to succeed more in 10 years versus, let's say, somebody who comes from a fairly normal family in US or Canada? And the research is strictly, and the story is essentially coming down to saying that, look, I think they have a bit more hunger. They don't have anybody to guide. They didn't have anybody to handhold. And the education system is trying to appreciate and give them that chance. And I think in many ways in India, what we're seeing is that the more of the urban Gen Zs are becoming, I don't want to use the word spoiled, but they almost feel like, look, I'm coming from this place. I've seen this. I've traveled here. I've done that. Therefore, if I don't like something, I'm going to walk out. And I think companies are really grappling with that. They really, really have to work very hard in ensuring the recruitment process is very, very tight and more so in filtering the attitude. I think the companies who are successfully able to retain talent are the ones who are actually kind of concentrating on, you have the values and the skills matrix, right? If you have the values but not the skills, you can give that. But if you have the skills and not the values, then I think there is a mismatch. And the best example I can think about, Irish, is in light of what is happening recently in India. When the 2008 attacks happened in Mumbai, the Tata Group, which owns the Taj Hotel, they obviously lost, guests and so on. There was this young girl. There is a TED talk on this where she could have ran and she could have saved herself, but she stood there and she and she basically saved the guest. And there's a Harvard professor who's kind of going to research on that. And what they found out is the recruiting practices of the Tata Group. They deliberately go and recruit from smaller towns, really, really interior parts of India, where getting that two square meal is actually a challenge. And they know that, okay, if I don't have the meal and if a guest comes for me, the guest is equal to a god. And so that value and that sort of belief system is easy to practice, right? And I just say that as an example that I think you see that stark difference. And I don't see this in a bad way, but there is more and more westernization happening. Unfortunately, it's polluting the way we think about the world.
I don't want to catch you in a slip, but I want to I do want to explore that. Let's not say westernization. Let's just say, not to offend people, let's say that there are external influences that
Sure.
are changing the thought patterns and behaviors of the East. What do those, so first of all, what were those thought patterns and behaviors? I think you've just given an example, a really good one and a really explicit one of a guest giving a meal and being treated, very, very well and being held to such a high regard. What are the consequences of those external influences coming in? And how do those change, just to offer a segue, how does that change the I guess, pursuit of certain people by companies, like the employment wants and needs by companies and managers?
Yeah. No, so first, I think just to your point, I think there is a lot of good that one can take and learn. I don't want to, we don't want to create a broad brush to say it's all westernization. The influence today, it's such a globally connected world. So let's just set that because I think there's some of the societies are, quite successful. They do certain things. It's almost like, I was talking to a colleague, they say that, okay, every time people come to Singapore, they're so impressed. And every time they go walk out of Singapore, they want to replicate Singapore, they cannot do it. Why is that? Just because of the fact that the values that people in that city, in that town have, which they're not able to replicate elsewhere, right? So I think that is good and bad. But to come to your point, I just say it is becoming increasingly about me, myself, and I, the sort of the Machiavellian way of looking at life. And I don't blame a country or a company or a brand, but I think the democratization of information and technology making it so easy, right? It's causing the anxiety of choices, the anxiety of decisions, the anxiety of we have a very good ad where everybody in the house is watching something on their device and the service provider says that, oh, you shouldn't worry because we have a plan just for each one of you. So the question becomes, what happened to that joint family where everybody was sharing and everybody was sort of, you know, but that's the change that's happening in the society. The son has his own device, the mother has his own device, right? Um, so I think Ayush, we've spoken before. One of the biggest challenges that Gen Z has, not just in India, not in Asia, across the world, is the sheer load of information and the ability to ground yourself for critical thinking. I think if the past week was any experience, and not to dive into that, there was such planes of information and misinformation on two sides of what is happening to the war, right? And I sense that a generation which is growing up, a generation who's in their teens, in their 20s, right? We all could be influenced with so much, right? Today, if I believe that, okay, country X is this, then I have equal amount of data that says country X is not this, right? And so I think doing that homework and just grounding yourself to the values. And I say that that's a lot of hard work for parents, a lot of hard work for the education institutes, and also a lot of hard work for the managers.
Okay, so we've come to a very interesting place now in the conversation. I do want to turn to how do you manage Gen Z, but let's just do a little recap. So Gen Z are very vocal, very creative, very, in some cases, very urbanized. In some cases, they are transitioning into being very urbanized. So there's a interesting dynamic over there. They are incredibly obviously tech savvy, but incredibly able to use technology to enact individual circumstances that they themselves deem appropriate according to their emotional state of the day. Um, Now we have understood that there are certain external influences happening in the Indian context of Gen Z. As a manager, maybe not just in India, but in general, let's start with how do you even begin to manage Gen Z who have that information overflow, who have all of those defining characteristics, who quiet quit? Where do you even start as a manager to begin to understand how to manage Gen Z?
Yeah, no, excellent question. Ayush, and I see so much of it. I think just, I mean, to come to the Indian story, I think 1 out of 5 Gen Z, they say is going to quit the job this year. And I think the central reason for so much attrition, and perhaps I don't know what are the numbers elsewhere, is the number one thing is disengagement. I've got someone in my system, but he or she's not happy, right? So he or she is not feeling excited about the work, right? And therefore, what are the reasons what can make that happen? And uh, Daniel Pink, his famous work about motivation is simply on sort of 3 pillars, or what he calls 4 pillars, the AMPS: autonomy, mastery, purpose, safety. So autonomy to me is most of us who worked, as a Generation Xer, matters so much. I mean, if I in my age don't have the freedom to make a decision, I will feel like, look, I'm happy to forego a fat salary just because I do want to exercise, I want to experiment. And that generation is perhaps expecting that in their 20s. So I think the sooner the manager can appreciate the fact that you cannot box them down. You're not going to be able to say, okay, come at 9, go at 5. And I can tell you enough stories, Irish, where we've had people, if companies are not agreeing to hybrid, Gen Z's quit. If they don't rotate them, they quit with a new task, right? I think so. A lot of what I would say the manager needs to do is to do away with the stereotype, just throw it out of the window, become very close to the person in doing frequent check-ins, what's happening with them, how's making a relationship, right? How's work going? Where else can we help? Be a true mentor, right? Can we actually get to know the person a little better? Um, be as transparent as you can. And in the corporate context, a lot of times in large companies, you go into a system, you don't know what you have to achieve. The goals are pretty vague, the goals are pretty ambiguous, and then you're there, you're getting frustrated, and then you leave. So being able to set really clear goals, being able to give feedback. And when I say feedback, it doesn't have to be like, okay, I put a slap on your knuckle. It just has to be a safe space, right? You're saying that, look, we did this, it didn't work out. Let's give you another try. Let's help you out. So I think there's more onus on the manager to make the feedback mechanism easier. Okay. And therefore, I don't mean by that sandwich feedback, the good, bad, and the good, but in a way where you're creating a safe space. So they're coming to you, they're sharing what's in their mind, they're able to give their ideas, and then finally recognizing them. And we've done lots of programs, Irish, with companies and middle managers where recognition is not confined to a salary hike. It could be a simple email. It could be recognition in a town hall. It could be sending them to taking a course. It could be the same role, but in a new location, right? It could be a cross-functional assignment. So you could do simple things. And uh, I think a lot of companies, Irish, who have implemented reverse mentoring, they are really seeing the success of holding on to Gen Z. And just as a point, as a last point, there is a company called SAP, which is it's an IT company, as you know, and it's an ERP company. SAP has produced 40 TikTok videos by their senior leaders. This was feedback given by the Gen Zs to them saying that if you wish to interact with Gen Zs, you don't need to be on a website, you don't need to be elsewhere, you need to be on TikTok. Imagine people with 40, 50 years of age bracket now getting onto TikTok, creating videos, 90-second videos, telling the world that, hey, come work for me because this is who we are. We're good because of this. And furthermore, kind of, if I'm posted in Montreal versus Bangalore, this is what I can do on a weekend. This is where I should go to shop. So I think we have to give them the voice, and we have to kind of give them the autonomy, make them good at something, and really drive home the purpose. I think very often people just say this, but very often it sounds very nice and great to say this, but can we actually paint the picture why you're doing this? I think the Gen Z really wants to know that. So the purpose, and then of course the safety.
I never really thought about like this unstoppable force meets the immovable object of Gen Z in the workplace because I never really thought about the salary inflation, like the salary expectations of Gen Z are coming in. And I really do think that it is, let's say, augmented is the wrong word, but it's kind of like propagated by social media where Gen Z are looking at really fat cat salaries and saying, I want that now at 25 without ever having, like, you just graduated with a degree, you have no experience, and yet you want to be on 250,000 because you saw Graham Stephan or whatever on YouTube saying that that's, the minimum to live or whatever. Um, yeah, it is such a precarious moment because I'm sure that some managers and some executives, I'd apologize for swearing, but are like, how the fuck like, why the hell am I being forced to understand how I can cater to a generation? It should be the other way around, no? And this is
Well,
why it's probably so difficult for them to understand because they're saying, I didn't have to do this for millennials or any other generation, but now I'm forced to do it for Gen Z, these people that are coming in. And there's also the flip side, which I'll get to. But also, one question I do want to ask is, does this stop at Gen Z or is this going to be a recurring thing? Do I also, as a manager and executive, have to understand Gen Alpha, Gen Beta, and on? But the second question is, there is an arrogance of Gen Z here that we have to address because it absolutely exists, and I don't want to pretend that it doesn't, where Gen Z go into these jobs with their head held high, expecting to change the establishment overnight, and there is an absolute friction that happens with young people when they don't get what they want.
yeah,
So those two questions I do want to ask you. We can start with the managers and just their visceral reaction to being
yeah.
forced to adapt to Gen Z rather than the other way around.
So excellent question, Ayush. I'll just say this, and you will appreciate this since you got such a good and strong technology background. I think I think when you think about the graduation that we've seen from industry 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, right? The 4.0, what is the nature of talent? In the 4.0, the nature of talent is not just someone who has STEM skills, right? The science, technology, engineering, math skill. You need to have transdisciplinary skills, and which means that if you look at COVID as an example, it wasn't enough for us to just create a good vaccine. What COVID taught us that we had to look at all the different angles. We had to think about who's going to get it. We had to think about how we're going to ship it. What's the pricing around it? What's the communication strategy around it? So you can no longer take the view that, I am good at one thing and that's it. And so I think this applies as much to the manager as it applies to the Gen Z, that there is a transdisciplinary sort of need for everyone. There is also the need for agility, which means that the manager who thinks that they knew and all had the answers will need to quickly forego what they knew. If, again, go back to COVID as an example. So if the manager is more stubborn, I think that there's a problem. Now, to your question about, hey, why do I need to kind of, invest so much? I I answer that question squarely, and this is largely in the Asian context. Ayush, I don't know how it applies there in Canada or elsewhere. Imagine you're in a room filled with 30 people. There is a good chance that of the 30, half are Gen Xers, the other 10 are probably millennials, and maybe the Gen Z population in that conversation is about three or four. And I always tell their bosses, so the millennials and the Xers, that you've got a 15-year runway. The Xers has at least a 15-year runway. The millennials have a 25-year runway. The Gen Z has at least a 40-year runway, or perhaps even more. which means that we're living longer. And if our average age of retirement was 65 and now going to 80 or 90, if you go to LinkedIn, you will see people applying for jobs in their late 60s. What does that mean? That means that more and more people are working longer. And does that mean that if I fast forward and I had that same workshop for that company 5 years from now, what will be the composition of that group or 10 years from now? There's a good chance that fewer Xers, fewer millennials, and more of the Gen Z. So it is incumbent upon the managers, the Xers and the millennials, to get to know the Gen Z because they will become and occupy more and more. And they will actually become the middle managers and the senior managers in 15 years, 10, 15 years, right? So that kind of answers your question about, let's not pretend that, okay, it's our time on the stage and, they will have to put in their due. So that's that. And you're talking about the second piece, which is again, the sense of entitlement and the sense of. I do agree that I think a lot of the urban phenomenon here in India, Irish, it's the same exact thing. Like I am hearing time after time after time. I was invited by um, INSEAD, and they had a large client in India where we were grooming 20 CEOs, and one of the teams was how do you lead next gen? And he was giving an example as a manufacturing company that there was some trouble in the plant, and he was responsible. The boss calls them, and the Gen Z says, you know what? I'm sorry, it's 11 o'clock. I will not care. What is the nature of emergency? Call me tomorrow. Now imagine, now there is, you imagine, this guy was on his knees saying, what else can I do? What do I do? Like, I have to find people I mean, in that role, it is the guys in their 20s. And he literally had to go to his house and say, look, it is your territory. You're responsible. So I think there is a bit of expectation setting, as you rightly said. 250,000 isn't going to come to you at the age of 25, unless you're a child prodigy, right? And therefore you have to put in the due. You have to put in. And I think Gen Z, because of technology, and I wish I'd love to kind of get your response. I think because technology makes everything so instant, I think they draw the parallel of that in the other walks of life, right? To say that I order something, it's coming, it's on the way. I mean, literally, I was in India. This is, my son's studying supply chain. They have a model here in India where you have what they call the dark stores. So the dark stores are there around the clock. You can order things and it's there in less than 10 minutes. Okay, forget about a 30-minute delivery, right? So I mean, you're living in a world where you're tapping things like he doesn't get out of the room. The guy comes down is in, and so I think are we kind of expecting everything else in my life in the same pace, right? Relationship, success, the ability to if I've fallen down, get up and succeed again at the same speed. So there's a bit of a sort of a course correction in just to say that look, life life doesn't, if you think about, how the tree grows, right? Tree just doesn't kind of grow tall. I mean, the branches take a little while for it to grow, right? I don't know if that analogy makes sense.
No, it
Uh,
absolutely calculates. It takes a long while for a tree that you've planted to show shade, right? And
exactly.
Gen Z expect shade to come overnight. No, it's a great point, and I absolutely agree with it. It's all about effort. I am not. I don't have to be hungry ever again if I have enough money because I can just continue tapping away on Uber Eats, right? I don't even have to leave my computer. It can be delivered to me. I mean, if my door is unlocked, I could literally text the guy to walk in my place and place it at the feet, right? Which is such a strange circumstance. But anyway, even for dating, right? I don't need to actually go up and look the girl in the eyes or guy or whatever you're into, and make
Go to the
conversations. Yeah, go to
yeah.
the app, right? Just download Tinder or Hinge or Bumble or Plenty of Fish or OkCupid or whatever the
Oh
app
my
of the day
goodness.
is,
Yeah.
and just continuously swipe and use really cheesy pickup lines, and eventually you'll meet someone, right? Or so is the case. And I have to pay $25 to $50 a month in order to get that across 17 different platforms, by the way. So that barrier to effort is so low that I don't need to actually exert anything to seemingly get what I want. Remember, like the difference in actually being successful is very large. So coming into the workplace, I haven't experienced any adversity in life for very basic things like a mate or food or water. And so coming into the workplace, especially now with AI and social media, growing up with social media, my entire cyber bubble was curated for me. So I never was introduced to different political views or different social views. So I expect the entire world to function in a way that it just doesn't, right? Because time on site matters and time on site increases ad revenue. And so why would they show me something that I don't like? Because then I would click off, right? So coming into the workplace now, I expect things
Yeah.
to just easily flow. And as soon as I met with adversity, I quiet quit. That feels like a really, let's say, healthy caricature of Gen Z right now. And then even adding on AI, as I was saying, I don't even have to critically think about the resume or the cover letter. I, at some points, I can just ask an agent to do it for me, right?
Yeah.
So it's this weird, you know, um, mental state of the generation across the
Yeah.
generation where they have no ability to understand what effort is. And if
Yeah.
anybody is telling them what effort is, they see that as the okay boomer thing. Like, yeah, it's the old guard, it's the old framework. And honestly, Nikhil, like again, I'm Gen Z. I've experienced all of these things. I'm not going to say I've suffered from all of them. I've suffered from some. I'm a fast learner, so I'm going to give myself credit for that, but I don't know what to do across the generation. Like, how do you get them to understand that like there is a way the world works, but
Yeah.
you can also innovate on that. Like there can be a balance. How do we even start that conversation?
Yeah, no, what a good point, you, Irish. I think, look, a lot of it comes down to the leadership style, right, Irish? And I'll say this, just coming from parenting into the work world. In the Asian context, Irish, you can appreciate, like, I think the parents are always a bit hesitant to not pat on the back way too much because if you're doing that, that child is head's gonna swell up. And then 8 out of 10 times they say good job, good job, good job. I think the child starts believing that he's just the best thing on planet Earth. And I think I think that you don't want to be the other extreme of that, which we see in some societies. But when you're at the workplace, a lot of what we hear about coaching and mentoring and all of that is well placed. I don't kind of discount that, but I also think there is more onus on the manager there to be good with the ability and the skill of feedback. In other words, if you're timid and if you're going to say that, hey, this is going to ruffle my feathers. And very sadly, I must say that a lot of times, even middle managers haven't acquired that skill set. And then the Gen Z, it just reiterates their belief system, right? So I pat Irish on the back 8 out of 10 times. And when it comes time for appraisal, and I say that, Irish, you know what? Sorry, I think I cannot give you that raise, but I'm going to give you this raise. What is Irish going to say? He's going to say that, look, you kept on telling me I'm good, good, good. But only for the two instances you said I wasn't good, you're not going to give me this, right? So I think how do we frame that is very important. And you want to be cautious. You want to acknowledge the good, but there's always the line of saying that, okay, don't do it where you get carried away with that, right? And the inflated perception of your own self, and it's doing nothing but just in a way setting you up for failure in the future. And I see this especially, and I that's where I say go back to ways in which you can manage emotions, ways in which you can manage resilience, ways in which you can manage setbacks, right? There's a beautiful story about they don't I think I don't know if it was Australia, some other country, they don't take anybody in the army uh, uh, not because you are not, fit or anything like that. If you've not experienced failure, if you've only been successful all the time, they're saying that how are you going to handle a setback? And so I think as parents or as managers, we also have to look at that a little more objectively to say that, look, can you handle this, right? And I feel that. Ayush, and I appreciate your candid, very candid sort of admission that I think I do fear that for the generation because, what happens if you're in a recession? What happens if the recession goes on for 2 years, 3 years, right? What happens if you don't have wealthy parents, right? Has someone told you about that? Has someone said that? Look, this could really happen, and that's where the world is going. More turbulence, more polarities and so on and so forth. So I think it's a process. It isn't something that you do by downloading knowledge, by downloading more books, by downloading more stories. It's to help them experience it, right? So get them to go through a failure, get them to experience that. Hey, listen, now in that situation, don't feel so bad, don't have self-pity. This is actually a good thing for you to grow, and you're going to bounce back even better from this.
Okay, we're at couples therapy now, and you're a Gen X, I'm a Gen Z. What do we need to be told in order for us to actually, work and coexist in harmony? Because this is the most important thing. I'm not saying that we're doing this and I'm kind of being a caricature of it, but I don't want to continue complaining about these things and just like, yeah, this is all doom and gloom and whatever. There are ways to get out of this, and it's easier than people realize, right? So, since we're at couples therapy, what are the things that maybe one or two things that each generation needs to really just hammer home and understand? It's not abrasive, it's not mean. This is the real world. We can handle it. We're all adults. What do we need to understand in order to, coexist in that way? Because there are incentives of living in harmony. With Gen X, they want to impart their wisdom and their legacy because Gen Z have the longevity. And for Gen Z, they've lived in such turbulent times, they crave stability in that way. They crave that occupational intimacy, which is a strange way to put it, but you know what I mean. They want
Yeah.
that, they crave that. What do we need to be told?
Yeah, no, again, excellent question. I think, Ayush, we have enough success stories, as you rightly said. We all come in, and again, I don't say this, there are books written about it, and obviously, yeah, and so on. But to simplify, I think in the real world, in the practical world, right? If I'm in a company today, there is a very good chance there's three generations at a minimum, four generations, right? And therefore, I think the culture that you create shapes everything, right? And so, can you, and I think we may have spoken before, but can you simply do a routine where you're coming together as a multi-gen team and you're putting to there what I call the assumptions audit, where we just say that, okay, I assume something about you, Irish, that, okay, because you're always on your device, you're disrespectful when in fact you could be answering to your father or someone who is ill in the family, whatever, right? I think each generation does a fair bit of their own for the other generation, so we have to accept that, and it starts at the top, and I would say go down, and also the messaging to Gen Z that hey, you have also an open mind kind of going up, right? And so, can we create a routine where we come together, we share, and we not just look at the differences, but how do we leverage that? Yeah, and I think the trick is in that. And so, there are ways in which companies do this. As I said, the assumptions audit is one um, where I come and talk about what I thought about it, and then I have to come and think about an alternate to what I may have assumed about you. So I think that, you know what, hey Irish, you were always on the device. Now the alternate could be that, okay, if there's something was really urgent, you could have just told me, hey guys, I'm gonna step out for 60 seconds. I gotta take this. It's something urgent at my home. So I think that way you're putting more and more each generation in the other person's shoe. Hopefully, you can appreciate and create more empathy. And as I say, culture doesn't happen by more stories. Culture happens by new routine. So in the company, in the corporate context, if you want a multi-gen team to succeed, you have to create new routines and you have to create it in a way that it sustains. So that is the trick, right? We don't want, some consultant coming and giving one more book or a new template. Can you do that over a period of 6 months till the time it becomes a DNA in your organization?
And this is the crux of your new book, Generational Fusion. I'd love for you to say more about what the book is and why you wrote it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I saw a lot. a lot of things, some of the things that we discussed on the Gen Z front. But what I was realizing is that it is not one way. Just as we talk about Gen Z getting singled out for, they're this, that, the other. I think it was a two-way street where the Gen Zs were also having a point of view about their bosses, about the lack of disengagement, a lack of engagement, lack of clarity on careers, right? Today, career is no more like, I go on one ladder for 20 years. It's a career lattice. I need to try 10 different things in my life before I feel like I've discovered the things I want. So the multi-gen book, the Generation Fusion, is really looking at the most predominant sort of issues that can grab a multi-gen conflict. So the ways in which conflict happens through communication. You prefer a device, I prefer an email. You prefer a voice note, I prefer a memo. Things like that. So communication could be an example. The values is an example. So I put through four or five very key. Hybrid is one big contentious point among generations. So I look at that, and then I call the second half of the book as the first half of the book is called the pods. What are the points of differences? The second of the book is called the pops, so points of parity. So I then talk about understanding the generation context, their perceptions, the stereotypes, the meta stereotypes that we have. How do we use Gen Z in shadow wars and things like that? So there are two parts of the story, but essentially it's really written with the intent of making multi-gen more cohesive and a very harmonious place.
Fantastic. And if you could offer the book to one generation, either Gen Z or let's say baby boomers and Gen X, not to say that they're the same generation, but I'm a Gen Z, so I consider everybody older than millennials to be the same. No offense. Um, which would which would you offer it to and why?
Okay, I think look, everyone has to play their part. So to be fair to the Gen Z, it is not just them who get the stereotypes and even on the boomers, right? But I think the one generation would benefit the most, Ayush, is perhaps the millennial generation, simply because they're sort of the sandwich between the Gen Z and the Xers. And there's a very good chance you being led by a millennial. So you have a Gen Z as a team member, but you likely have a Gen X as their boss. And if you think about these three cohort, they will likely remain in that formation for another 10 years. So the millennials are the one sort of the middle managed population, if you think about who should think about it. But again, and you asked for one generation, but I think it's all generation equally kind of need to look at it.
And this is highly personal to your work, but are you going for the rest of your career to stick with Gen Z or also move on to Gen Alpha and Gen Beta? Like, do these pieces of knowledge transcend into other generations, or are you just going to stick with one?
No, that's a good question, Ayush. Honestly, I don't have the definitive answer, but what I did realize over my last few years of consulting work and in the leadership space before that is that no matter what technology comes in, whether you talk about AI or everything else, at the end of the day, some form of human element is always there in the workplace, and more and more people are working longer, they're staying longer, so it's going to become more heterogeneous. Therefore, this whole generational complexity of the workplace is only going to become more complex. Therefore, the alpha will be there in another 5, 7 years. Beta, we've got a while for that. But I thought that is a good niche, and I did it more so because out of my own curiosity. So to answer your question, I don't know, but I do know that this is something that anyone who manages a team will always have to keep in mind. Who's the generation before? Who's the generation after? And take the time to kind of get to know them.
It would be such a cosmic irony if you have to talk to Gen Beta and Alpha as they are the Gen Z now and talk to Gen Z in like 15, 20 years like they're the baby boomers now.
Oh my goodness, that's the Gen Z. You let me know. How do you
Yeah.
feel about
I
that?
I mean I speaking like seriously just for a second, but I was watching some Instagram reel on Gen Alpha slang, and it was supposed to be this funny reel of like this English professor talking in Gen Alpha's language, right? That's a terrifying generation because they really just have no clue what they're talking about. I have no understanding of what Gen Alpha is, and they're in high school right now, which is very worrying. So this generation coming up, I mean, they were like socially disrupted during COVID, technologically blunted with social media, mature social media, and um, immature to mature artificial intelligence. So I'm not. It'll be really fun to do some research on Gen Alpha, maybe even write a book on it. But I am not looking forward to.
Well, as they say, welcome to leadership, Ayush. I think the when millennials first came on board, everybody was kind of talking about them, and I've seen millennials complain so much about the Gen Zs in their team, and I've had to do workshops just to how they manage. But you're right because you're looking at from your lens, they're looking obviously from a different lens, but and with AI we only know how much of the human element's going to remain for think about the alpha and the beta generation, right? Will they even as someone said, I think was it Bill Gates who said that, okay, 90% of the code written by large tech companies will be gone in about 5 years time. So what will people do? What will engineers do, right? So this is a real question. I mean, you may still make it through. You've got another 20, 30, 40 years of, but imagine that generation, right? They're going to enter after 5 years where automation is part of their life, right? They don't know a pre-automation world.
Yeah, Generation
So
Alpha,
it is
it's
scary,
Generation
yeah.
Automation. Yeah. It's going to be a really terrifying thing for them because if Gen Z are already being booted out of jobs, entry level jobs, Gen Alpha just have no starting chance.
What's
Like
coming their
there's
way?
well yeah, they have no bloody clue. And I'm really, worried because they have no skills at essay writing, which means they have no skills at, skills with critical thinking and they have no attention span. But like, what does that entail for an entire generation to not be able to write an essay? And this is just an arbitrary thing, right? It's an arbitrary use of a concept to describe their uh, inability to think critically at length and compare concepts. I mean, what happens to politics down the line if people don't like the current U.S. administration now? Think about the voters and a couple of years.
Yeah.
It presents a very stark and interesting problem, which I don't know many people can solve. That seems like a little bit of a meta crisis.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, you make essay as an example, Irish, but I totally understand where you're coming from. Where are we going down the path where, I mean, I see like college kids today around the world, I see it here in India as well, where they're just relying on generative AI, right? And you almost wonder like, what is happening, right? And therefore, yeah, for that generation, I mean, we're in the nascent stage. Right? What will they see the evolution of where that's going to go? So it's interesting time, but that's a puzzle for the Gen Z to solve.
Yeah, and I mean, Gen Z are also relying on generative AI to the point where they're going to ask generative AI how to solve the
There you
problem of
go.
Gen Alpha using generative AI, which is, you know, very frustrating. Okay, Nikhil, I've taken up enough
All
of your
right.
time. I have two more questions for you, and I'm not setting this up just based off of the last couple of questions. But if you had a magic wand and you could solve any problem in the world, what would it be and why?
Well, I don't know. I think the world is just becoming increasingly so polarized, and I sense that just to deviate from our topic, but I sense that a lot of this walls that we're creating, whether it is the geopolitical view of how people see themselves and the countries and what they stand for and the ideologies, I feel like I think the human race is actually suffering as a result of that, right? And you could be in one place thinking, oh, but I have, I think uh, unhappiness is spreading is amongst every one of us, despite the fact that we've made such progress in technology. So I would say that whether technology goes up, down, can we create that simple sort of humanness amongst each other where happiness can be felt. And I really, really think that if you're living 100 years, but you're solely living on what technology will tell you to do, my question is, how good is that 1 century of living, right? Would you rather not live where you live for a time, but you live in fully exploring to what the human should be, right? And I think that would be my magic wand to make the human feel the emotions and all the feelings that we have that no other species has, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
No, that's beautiful. I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree that if you're living for 100, or let's say even like if we're doing longevity, then let's say 120, 150 years, but you're bloody miserable, that's, I would not want to live for that long, you know. And we can even, cut it down to like 50 years.
Yeah.
What's the point of doing a 50-year career if you're absolutely miserable in it? Okay, let's not end on pessimism. Let's end on optimism. What gives you hope in the world?
So again, I say if there was a time, if leadership is something that can change, I think this is the time where we're seeing immense amount of change, and a lot of, as you say, is not all doom and gloom. In every story, right? As they say that you have thorns, but there's always a rose that grows in the thorns, right? And therefore, I do think that how we build, how the society looks at building leaders, will really kind of change, what we experience, and we have such good examples. So your own self-awareness, good conscious parenting, good social responsibility, being just good managers, right? Some of that, I think, if we all do, I think we're all making a dent, and therefore I have full hope and optimism that good leadership, even if it's making a dent 1 bit at a time, is capable of changing the world.
Fantastic. Nikhil, always a pleasure talking with you. Where can we find you online? Where can we find your book?
Excellent, Ash. So again, 2 places. One, I'm active on LinkedIn. So the easiest way is to look me up on LinkedIn, Nikhil Raval, and you can look at the work that I do there. The other is my website, which is learnwisely.in, which is, again, kind of gives you the bouquet of the work that I do. And the book is called Generational Fusion: How to Master the Multi-Gen Workforce Uniting Strengths Across Ages, is available on Amazon and all major portals. So check that out, the paperback and the ebook both.
Fantastic. Nikhil, always a pleasure. We'll talk very soon. Thank you for the episode.
Okay, thank you, Irish. Take care. Bye.